Within each long-running fandom, there's often a question asked by those eager to jump in. The answer is sometimes fairly simple. Other times it's incredibly complicated, or comes with a lot of baggage. Many people hold their own beliefs based on which game they found the most engaging mechanically, others on which has the most emotional narrative, and still others look at which game has the most polish or is the most indicative of the norm for the series, or which one accommodates for new players the best. Final Fantasy is one of the series where people find an answer difficult to pin down though. So today I'm gonna try and offer my opinion. Today, without spending ages breaking everything down or spoiling any major story or endgame content, we're going to answer the question, which Final Fantasy should you play first? The reason this question is so multi-layered and complex is because the Final Fantasy series itself is the same way. There are certainly through lines across the series, but each game still sets a distinct precedent for itself, aiming to stand apart from its peers and predecessors so that it feels like a fresh experience. With that said, I think we still can create a few groups of games which will better allow us to narrow down which group leans best toward new players. The first group is definitely the early 2D era, made up of Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. These games are obviously the start of the series, and some people really value going in order at any cost. But for me, Final Fantasies 1 through 3 are also really rough on their original platform. They largely have simplified story beats, don't guide the player particularly well, are mechanically slow and stiff in nature compared to the later titles, and have some brutal player expectations. It's not uncommon to cross a sudden invisible line on the world map, where random encounters suddenly become insurmountable for a new player and a weak party. Get a game over and you could lose a lot of progress, meaning unless you've already played the game before, grinding and rushing back to an inn over and over isn't an uncommon practice. Each of these games comes with several difficulty spikes for newer players as well, and much of their strategy is hidden behind seriously meta understandings of how the mechanics function. So I'd say these aren't the best place to start. Many people would probably recommend the next bunch then, which we'll call the pinnacle of the 2D era, consisting of Final Fantasy 4 through 6. No, we're not going to include the Legends games or Mystic Quest or Adventure for a whole host of reasons, because they really don't prepare players well for the rest of the series. Final Fantasy IV isn't a terrible place to start by any means, as it's the first title to really push for a more intricate plot, with deeper characters and a greater focus on systems. It's also the birthplace of the active time battle system most of the series uses or references heavily. But this game too has some clunky player guidance and some major difficulty spikes, which may particularly be too much for younger players getting into the series. Final Fantasy V is my favorite of the 2D titles for the sheer variety and depth of the mechanics at play. It's also generally a game that likes to have fun, which for some can be a great way to get them invested. Just like 4, it's clunky though in a few ways, and I think it could easily be overwhelming for players new to the series, and especially the genre as a whole. There's a lot to keep in mind in Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy VI is probably the smoothest ride out of these three, and is a favorite of many for what it does with its characters and story. It also reins in the variety of 5 systems by keeping character roles static, and instead allowing them to swap equipment that gives them a plethora of abilities. The variety is still rather freeform like 5, without being too dense, and the unique character abilities can provide players a bit more strategic focus so that they're thinking more about party dynamics and less about min-maxing. That being said, 6's main weakness as a first game is in its world map conveyance, as well as the relatively narrow set of modern hardware you can play it on. There are certainly people who simply don't like playing on PC, and yet the PS3 or Game Boy Advance are just a bit too old to be comfortable with for them. And while playable, I certainly wouldn't suggest playing your first Final Fantasy on a phone under any circumstances. Meanwhile, when every town on the world map looks the same, once the game starts asking you to return to old areas, it's incredibly easy to get stuck or lost without using a guide. Before we get to the next group, I feel it's necessary that we briefly discuss the various ports and remakes of the 2D titles. Not because I think any of them are the best starting point either, though many of them are certainly an improvement. Rather, we should do it simply to be thorough. There are many ports of games like Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Some of them are better than others, but many of them are again stuck on PC or on aging hardware. What's more, they usually go for a style that's less indicative of the series as a whole, which may not give players the right picture of the series. Generally, these are still an improvement in terms of accessibility for new players, though, so I wouldn't say most of them are a terrible option if you're okay with old hardware or the PC. Next up would be the PS1 Era titles, being Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9. Final Fantasy VII definitely isn't a bad place to start if you're okay with a little jank. It's similar to 6 in that it offers a lot of freedom to customize your party setup, while still giving characters a few unique characteristics that set them apart. This game is also the easiest up to this point in terms of broad strokes difficulty balancing. There are bosses that will crush a weak player, but not quite so readily as many of the previous titles. The amount of difficulty spikes is pretty low. Final Fantasy VII's biggest issue is simply that it can feel aged by today's standards, can sometimes be so easy that players don't learn the necessary knowledge to push to harder titles, and has some messy storytelling that diverges from the more traditional high fantasy for a lot more steampunk grit. Final Fantasy VIII is similarly strange in the storytelling department, but many would argue it also goes off the rails. Mechanically, a lot of people also find it incredibly obtuse, and if you don't know what you're doing, it can be by far one of the most difficult journeys in the series. But if you do pick the mechanics up, you'll be able to dominate everything so easily that, again, you won't really learn the skills the rest of the series will start to ask of you. Final Fantasy IX, by contrast, is a sharply focused game most of the way through, with great characters, a lighthearted but still emotionally charged tone, deep themes, and callbacks to the core of the series up to this point. It's a fantasy game through and through, and goes back to having well-defined classes. Once again, characters can share equipment to gain abilities, but the core of each class is extremely distinct. That means players have a lot of options to explore while still not entering the realm of choice paralysis like with titles like Final Fantasy V. Strategically, the game can be rewarding, but similar to 7, it's also not particularly difficult unless you're looking for a challenge. Still, it explains its mechanics well and feels pretty modern in spite of its age. Final Fantasy X sits on its own as a transitionary period between the classic games and the more modern ones. I'm sure many people would suggest this game as your first in the series, but I don't think I agree. Final Fantasy X has a strong story with fantastic characters and a lot of history to chew on. This is one of the most emotion-focused stories in the series, and is the first one with mostly fully 3D environments and voice acting for most cutscenes. It also throws out the active time battle system, giving players all the time in the world to make decisions on each turn, and focuses combat on a mildly engaging game of rock, paper, scissors based on which party members excel at which tasks. Interestingly, you can switch party members in and out of battle at any time, so you effectively have a full party of all jobs at all times, and every character sees use. The problems with Final Fantasy X as a first game are twofold, however. Firstly, even in the modern ports, cutscenes still aren't skippable. This might not be so bad, except for the second half of the game throws brutal difficulty spike after brutal difficulty spike at the player. These bosses are easily some of the most strategically diverse and rewarding in the series, but they also love to throw clever tricks at you and surprise you with their own complex strategies the rest of the game definitely doesn't prepare you for. Comparatively, most of the random battles are over before enemies even get a turn, if you're using the rock, paper, scissors system like you're supposed to. While I'm not opposed to this being an earlier game people pick up for what it does right, it's also a game that's extremely easy to get stuck in later on, and watching pre-boss cutscenes a dozen times isn't widely considered a good time. Final Fantasy XII is in many ways a game that excels in all places that lend well to a new player. It's challenging but not overwhelming, it's mechanically diverse if you play the original version, and has a bit more focus if you play the modern ports based off of an earlier remixed re-release that only came out in select regions. It also has some of the best writing, acting, and cinematography in the series by miles. Unfortunately, as with the remaining titles, Final Fantasy X-2, 11, 13, 13-2, 13-3, 14, and 15, it's pretty drastically different from the rest of the series in terms of core movement and combat. These titles all have their strengths, and in some ways are probably the most easy to get into by far, due to their modern sensibilities. But if we're looking for something that also represents the series as a whole well, playing 12 or 15 and enjoying it won't necessarily translate to enjoying 4 or 7. I'd say out of all of these titles, 12 is the best option if you don't care about the game being hugely representative of the series as a whole. If you ask me, despite it not being my favorite, it's the most polished and well-made game the series has to offer. That means a lot, but it's not everything. We need a game that says Final Fantasy when you see it. A game that's not too difficult, but not too easy. A game that offers strategic depth, while still narrowing down the focus enough to train players in a broader sense that translates beyond that one game's mechanics. We need a game that exudes fun, offers just enough polish to not feel clunky, but doesn't stray too far from what we most commonly see from the series. So despite some of its flaws, I think if you want to start the Final Fantasy series, you should go with Final Fantasy IX. It's far from a perfect game, but for my money, it seems to be the one that's most likely to illustrate what makes Final Fantasy so special, while getting players excited to expand into the stranger and more exotic games from there. But what do you guys think? Which Final Fantasy do you think people should start with? Which one is probably the worst to start with? Why do you feel one way or the other? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.